Okay, so this is the part 6 tutorial, and this is going to just be covering configuration files. So configuration files are quite useful for setting basic pieces of information that are not really going to change over time, even though you have the opportunity to actually change them if you really need to. So a good reason behind using this in this context is setting up a site configuration file. And one of the pieces of information I want to be able to manage is a contact email for the site. So jumping back into the code, if we look at the config folder in the current site, we can see, if we just have a look at a random one like app, you can see all it's doing is opening with a PHP tag and just returning an array. So if we copy config the structure, so source config, and the config file I'm wanting to set up is site.php. So doing the PHP opening tag followed by return, and just set a comment specifying the purpose of the file, so site configuration. And as I said, I'd like to use this config just to set basic contact information. So I'm going to do a level down contacts as an array item, and inside this contact array I'm going to have email. So I'm not going to use my own email, I'm just going to use a John Doe equivalent. So john.doe at website.com. Make sure there's a semicolon on the end. So that's the configuration file done. Now the complicated part with this is that in order to use this in the application, the config always has to live in the config folder in the root. You can't actually load configuration files directly from the package. So in order to do this, you need a publish command, which will actually make a copy of the file from the package and move it into the config folder. So all you need to do for this command is just this publishes, and then this function just takes an array. So the first part of the array is the location of where the file that is going to be moved lives. So we've already got path helpers for base and resource, so we just need to create a new function for config. So again, all I'm going to do is return this base path and prefix it with the config folder just called config, and then make sure it's including the path. So this is the new helper I'm going to use. So the first parameter is just this config path, and then you actually need to state the name of the file like in the roots part. So the file name with the PHP extension. So looking at the config file, it's just site.php. And the second parameter is the destination. So as you can see, I'm copying the Laravel path helpers to keep it consistent. So this helper will point to the root folder of the site, and then the config that lives within the root. So this also needs to be site.php. So with this part done, you need to jump into the command line, run php @ vendor publish, Sorry, I seem to have set that to a comma instead of an arrow. So if I try running that again, and you should be able to see a site.php, which is an exact copy of the one that was in the config folder, although I seem to have accidentally not used an @ symbol, so I'll just quickly replace those. So that's the config published, and that means we'll now be able to use the config function to read the site file. But another thing that is a good idea to do is to merge the config files. So the idea behind this is that you can have a config file that lives within the package, and you only use the config that lives in the base folder to change any settings specifically for the application. So you may want to use the configuration file for options that you don't really change that often, but you want to be inherited in the application. So to use this, all you need to do is call the function merge config from, and then the first parameter is the path to the package site config. So this config path site.php again, and now you actually need to name the config that it's getting merged with, which is the file name but without the PHP extension. So to prove that this is working, I'm basically going to pull in this config in the view. So if I jump back into the package and go on views and go on pages, sorry, I just had to pause the video for a moment there. I seem to have accidentally dragged one of my files into the wrong folder, but now resuming on to where I was beforehand. So I've got the page, the view for the page open, and I'm actually going to change this to serve up content from the config, but I'm assuming this will be available as a variable. So looking at the config site, I'm wanting to read out the email. So in Blade syntax, this is just the double curly brackets followed by the variable that I'm going to be setting the contact array item to, and then email. So I'll now need to go into the controller and load this config and pass it through to the view. So jumping into the controller, simply going to do contact equals config site contact, and then use a PHP function called compact to set an array to pass to the view file, with the variable being set to an array item. So as you can see, it's now outputting the email. I'm just going to change that so it's actually showing email in front of it to make it clear. So you can see that's now reading one of the site configs. In this case, it'll be the one in the root directory. And if I change this, so if I just change website to site.com and reload, you can see that change is being picked up. So the changes, because in the config in the package it's still got website.com instead of site, you can see it's prioritizing the information in the config in the root directory. But if we get rid of this completely, so just return an empty array, you can see it'll fall back to the original information that's still in the package config. So that's it for now. And in the next tutorial, I'm going to cover some more front-end based workflows.